incident response.
Коллеги, сразу хочу сказать, что если вы хотите
Dear colleagues,
вопросы, то
if you want to ask questions,
QR-код.
you know what to do. That's the QR code for that.
Ну, так получилось, естественно, не случайно, что тема моего доклада, она продолжает...
Somehow it happened so that
но она продолжает
in my presentation, I will be talking about similar things to what Anna has been talking about, though my attitude is slightly different.
И, значит, какие эти метрики могут быть?
So we'll be talking about the metrics for response.
Ну, немного про себя. Меня зовут Константин Смирнов. Значит, я по образованию я инженер-системотехник, то есть вот я человек, который учился
So I'm a systems engineer. I learned to design computers.
В обеспечении непрерывности бизнеса, оттуда приехал в информационную безопасность. Вот, за плечами много различных компаний, в том числе крупных, международных. Вот, и, значит, наконец я здесь в позитиве.
And finally, I'm here as Positive Tech.
Сегодня я
Positive
хотел бы
Security.
поговорить о том, как измерять инциденты информационной безопасности.
Now, my plan was to discuss the issue of assessing cybersecurity incidents, and in particular, I'm interested in the time-related parameters.
Как приглашение к дискуссии.
What we're going to discuss today is certainly not a mantra. This is just an invitation to a discussion.
Ну, о чем будем говорить? Мы остановимся, естественно.
So what shall we be talking about? We should certainly start with the terminology. We'll briefly touch upon risks and inadmissible events. Critical events. Next, we'll talk about the life cycle of InfoSec events. And finally, we'll discuss the metrics you may want to care about throughout the life cycle. After that, we'll discuss Tolkien. Raise your hand if you watched The Lord of the Rings. Oh, good, good. Thank you so much. Then it won't be difficult for me to drive my point home. And after that, we are going to discuss a particular dramatic episode from that movie and how it's related to incident response. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about applying those measures in practice.
Откуда взять данные для этих метрик? Потому что это немаловажно.
Finally, we'll talk about, finding data for these metrics. Now, before we move on, I should possibly say that all these presentations should be findable in public access. At the end of my presentation, there will be several slides I'm not going to show because they are too busy.
Там много тоже полезного и важного.
But you may find them very interesting nonetheless. So how do we assess an incident?
В первую очередь, конечно, все знакомы с понятием рисков по классическому определению. Риск – это
So you all know the classical definition. According to it, a risk is a combination of the probability and the impact according to ISO standards. The risk is the impact on the operations. And they say that it's a potential event with its consequences or repercussions. Now, we are not bad at identifying or assessing the consequences. So it's easy for us to talk about money lost or reputation hurt or data leaked. But assessing probability is much more difficult. If somebody tells you, I know how to calculate probabilities, I think you will be quite skeptical about it. Now, if we consider definitions of incidents under ISO, you will remember this, one of the numerous events which will most probably lead to business interruption. So ISO will also tell us that information security is all about confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility I guess everybody present here today can easily recite this triad, even if you wake them at night. So this is, a disruption in the company's activities, which leads to a breach in integrity, confidentiality, or accessibility, separately or jointly, so to speak. So a risk is an incident which has a certain probability associated with it. So like we said, we know how to go about those consequences, We developed numerous tools for calculating this stuff a long time ago, but it's much more difficult with probabilities because they are in a flux all the time. Even if we thought yesterday that we knew what the probabilities were, today everything is different. There are no guarantees here. Now let's discuss inadmissible or critical events because they're not the same as risks. I'm not going to read out a definition here for you, particularly given how many times it has already been mentioned. But effectively, it's an event that happens due to some cyber reason, which introduces disruption in your company's operations. And it's so bad that, the company badly wants to avoid it. So how do we go about it? Well, we start by projecting it, so to speak, against your IT infrastructure. You analyze the scenarios that can lead to it, such as, defrauding money. So maybe you, change something in master data or in the PO and so on and so forth. So next, we project these inadmissible events on the IT infrastructure, and we get a particular scenario. And this scenario tells us which information system needs to be attacked by the hacker in order for such an inadmissible event to occur. So how do we go about probabilities here? Is there any way for us to know if such an event is indeed possible?
Нам это понять, давайте рассмотрим несколько концептуальных понятий.
Now let's consider several important concepts here.
Красивая загогулина, значит, это жизненный цикл.
This is an incident life cycle.
Безопасности. Он такой свернут в колечко, потому что, концептуально
it's shown in a loop.
Непрерывный процесс.
Because conceptually speaking, it's certainly a cyclical process.
Компании, так же как и люди, они, значит, непрерывно учатся на своих ошибках.
Companies, just like people, they tend to learn from their mistakes. That's exactly what's happening here. So we see that something is happening here. We are able to overcome the challenges that life throws our way, and we continue. Now, obviously, this cycle here is sort of symbolic because obviously we understand there are numerous incidents happening at the same time, and we'll be responding to them all. And with regard to different incidents, we'll be at different stages. But, generally speaking, it can be shown like this. And this should also put you in mind of the dumbing cycle, PDCA, plan, do, check, act. Like philosophically speaking, this is almost the same thing.
В любой автоматизированной системе,
in any automated system,
значит, только что говорила,
and this is something that Anna has just mentioned,
если у нас есть какой-то SOAR, если у нас,
like if you have some SOAR,
мы, естественно, видим следы, значит,
you will see
обработки каких-то наших инцидентов в какой-то системе, да, везде есть какой-то тикет,
traces of our incidents being
даже иногда ведут, значит, журнал реагирования на инциденты, и там отмечается, что там в такое-то время мы там этот инцидент приняли, в такое-то там время...
So in your incident response log, you will see, for example, that this one we discovered that it was delegated to this person.
В какой-то момент он там был закрыт.
And eventually it was closed.
Соответственно, это очень важно, чтобы мы, значит, ввели и хотя бы понимали, как это происходит, то есть как живет инцидент.
So it's important for us to understand how it happens, what the life cycle of an incident is.
И вот развернув это самое колечко, значит, разомкнув его и...
Now, if we unlock this cycle and we look at it longitudinally, so to speak, along the timeline. Now there is a slightly busier version of the same chart at the end of my presentation, but we are looking at a simplified version today. So what do we see here?
Несколько, они вот красненьким, здесь красненькой рамочкой помечено. Вот. У нас, значит, есть важная такая картинка, то есть важный показатель, это время.
There is this important indicator here,
Это время до начала атаки. То есть вот,
which is the time until the attack starts.
хакер, вот мы добежали до порога вот той самой.
Now, as a hacker,
Свою бомбу собираемся взорвать.
I've reached the threshold of the system where I'm about to plant my bomb. So I'm at the threshold here. I'm about to push the button. So it's a time from infiltration to time to blow up, or time to attack, usually called.
Начало выполнения действий согласно цели атаки. Ну, и надо понимать, что, естественно, он может быть как и изнутри атаковать, так и снаружи.
Naturally, this attack can be done from the inside or from the outside. The phases will be just the same. It's just that the entry point will differ.
С точки зрения реагирования на инцидент,
Now, from the viewpoint of reacting to the incident,
значит, важный параметр. Вот.
there is naturally an important parameter here, which is TTD, time to detect.
Значит, когда у нас проник
From the time
нехороший человек, значит, в нашу систему, до
the
того момента,
perpetrator
как
enters the system,
алерт, подозрение на инцидент.
to the time we generate the first alert that tells us it could be an incident.
Сколько времени у нас в очереди?
The next important thing is how long is the incident waiting
в очередь до тех пор, пока его не
in the log or in the queue
что-то сделать. Вот
before it's addressed.
начали, значит, что-то с ним делать. Вот. И дальше мы выясняем, а это вообще что? То есть это легитимное, нелегитимное, может быть, это легитимная активность. Вот нам
Next, we need to pass a judgment on that. Maybe it's legit.
Следующий наш параметр – это time to qualify, время верификации.
Now, our next parameter is time to qualify.
То есть это время оценки.
After that, we have time to investigate.
Информация о масштабе происходящего, то есть насколько это массовый, может быть, он не массовый там. Вот.
So, in the investigation stage, we try to discover how widespread it is.
Мы принимаем решение,
And that's a very important stage, because there we decide what to do next.
Может быть, нам надо взять и там оборвать.
Maybe the best thing we can do is just pull the cord.
Или нам какой-то плейбук у нас есть, там, по которому мы можем...
Or maybe we have a playbook to follow.
Дальше у нас с вами есть важный показатель, это
Next, we have
это время,
another important indicator,
время
time
локализации.
to contain.
Это от момента, когда мы приняли решение, что делать, до того
Now, from
момента, когда
the moment we've decided what to do, to the moment when further expansion of the threat agent becomes impossible because we have isolated it.
Показатель это time to response, то есть это тот самый момент.
And there is this general indicator, which is TTR, time to response. Just like Anna showed previously.
Циклу. Вот у нас с вами здесь есть локализация, устранение, восстановление. Вот
We have here localization
это от начала локализации до окончания.
and remediation, restoration.
И еще важный такой зонтичный параметр, который вот
Another important umbrella parameter
handle time. Вот это время,
called HT, handle time.
которое, допустим, если у нас построена многоуровневая система, или 1, или 2, или 3, потому что здесь у нас с вами
It's like if we have a multi-tier system,
на котором
L1,
заявка
L2,
находится в
L3.
руках, допустим, у тех, кто реагирует на инцидент.
is the time a particular alert is being handled by the responsible employees.
Handle time нам очень важны с точки зрения оценки наших
Now, QWT and HT are very important parameters because they effectively tell us, how good we are at responding to incoming incidents.
Я как бы не буду здесь останавливаться, потому что это все будет...
I'm not gonna dwell on that. All this stuff should be available for download later.
С экрана. Вот.
I don't want you to read it off the screen.
Итак, добежит, не добежит. Наш...
Now let's discuss a particular case. This is the part where we analyze Tolkien.
Эпизод — это битва при Хельмовой паде.
So you might remember this one, the battle at Helm's Deep.
Вы, как все помните, Сурман
So you might remember that Saruman prepared a bomb.
крепость при Хельмовой паде.
So he was about to blow up this Helm's Deep. So he put some sort of explosive in this huge cauldron. So he was about to blow up the wall where there was like a small inlet that a stream went through. So he found a vulnerability that he wanted to exploit. Now you will remember that they put the bomb under the wall, and Theodan and Aragorn saw it, but they didn't understand what was happening. It was only when an Uruk-hai ran carrying a torch there, they realized what was happening. So Aragorn was the first to twig it. So he shouted to Legolas, shoot. They were not able to stop the Uruk-hai, so he blew it up. Uruk-hai, obviously, here is the threat agent. And, he was part of the campaign initiated by Saruman. So he was able to blow the wall up. Now, let's commit this dramatic episode to memory and return to this simplistic schema.
Ну, наверное, это такая довольно очевидная вещь, но тем не менее, как бы стоит...
It might seem obvious, but I think it's a good idea for us to discuss it. When does an inadmissible event happen? Well, it happens when we start reacting too fast and we don't react fast enough. When the threat agent runs too fast and you do not have enough time to unleash your flurry of arrows, a volley of arrows. So, inadmissible events do not materialize if the attackers are slower, because you slow their progress down, potentially. Like you can see them moving through the system earlier. So we either react faster, or they work slower, or a combination of the two.
Следующую картинку. Вот мы с вами разложили такую, значит, нашу вот этот вот киноэпизод только с точки зрения...
So this movie episode here is shown through the lens of our framework. So Aragorn was able to spot the Uruk-hai runner quite fast, meaning that, the moment it started happening, they were already aware of that. On the other hand, you can say, well, he already covered some distance to the wall, and Aragorn started suspecting something. So you can say that was the first time that defenses got triggered. So Uruk-hai continues running, and Aragorn tells Legolas, yells to Legolas, shoot him, because he feels something bad is going to happen. But, it's too loud there, and Legolas doesn't hear him, and then he doesn't really understand what he is shouting in due time. The alert has already been generated, but Legolas does not respond to it fast enough. The cue wait time is quite long. So the moment he understands it, he starts pounding the Uruk-hai with his arrows, but that was not good enough. So detection was almost instantaneous. Verification or qualification were late, and response was not powerful enough. They failed to stop the attacker, and he hit the defenses quite successfully. Now, it's pretty much the same picture with a level of sophistication added to it. So when do inadmissible events happen? They do so when all the activities within TTR take longer than the attack time.
Мы можем говорить, что мы успешно отражаем.
The same idea, but differently, is that we are successful in fending attacks off when the total time required to detect, to handle, and qualify, and at least isolate the threat is shorter than the time it takes for them to trigger the inadmissible event.
Существенно меньше времени атаки.
preferably should be way smaller.
Допустим, предыдущий оратор, Анна показывала, что некоторые из этих
Anna, the previous speaker,
можно задать, допустим, какой-то фиксированный параметр.
said that you can attach some fixed parameter to some of these phenomena. For example, QA time can be set at like 5 or 10 minutes.
Типовых инцидентов
And for most typical incidents,
задавать некое стандартное время.
that would make a lot of
Для
sense.
более сложных инцидентов, естественно,
For more complex incidents,
целевые параметры задавать сложнее, потому что они не
it could be more difficult.
никогда там не справляться, у нас не было.
Maybe you've never been exposed to that. Maybe you don't have a playbook for that.
Значит, и я повторю опять предыдущего оратора, так получается, что я все время повторяю, потому что замечательно.
Somehow, I keep repeating the previous speaker. She is very, very talented. She said lots and lots of very good things, so I feel good about repeating her.
Статистический подход.
Naturally, doing statistics here makes a lot of sense,
Хотя, как видите, мы
because we're dealing here not just with an individual case.
инцидент определенного типа.
I can imagine that this incident belongs to a certain category,
Сравниваем нашу
so
реакцию на
we
типовой
should be able to compare our reaction to this incident to, well, the average attack, so to speak.
Мы понимаем, как это происходит.
Something that we have enough statistics on, like we know what the kill chain is, we know how we respond, so we can see if we are responding fast enough or not. On the other hand, some things are not that easy. So in some cases, you may want to use the statistics-based approach when, for example, you are seeing a combination of attacks that take different routes and therefore they can have different lengths.
Вот. И, конечно, такая совокупность, такой статистический подход
So
даст
such combination, or rather this statistics-based approach,
картину. Вот.
will give us higher
В
visibility.
случае простого инцидента сработает и простое сравнение. Да,
Although for a simple incident, you probably need a simple response,
величины.
or just, in this case, a simple
Значит,
comparison.
прежде чем мы поговорим про сравнение метрик, да, мы
Now, before we talked about metric comparison, we need to discuss where data for these metrics can potentially come from.
а вы не
Now,
можете
for example, if you have this great metric
вычислить,
and you don't really know how to calculate it,
потому что
then it's obviously useless. Why would we need a metric? Naturally, we need metrics to make some managerial decisions.
Оно будет, просто будет какая-то случайная вещь. Вот.
Otherwise, it will be just a random noise.
В первую очередь, опять-таки,
How can we get this data?
говорила Анна, да, это
Well, just like Anna said,
предыдущих инцидентов. Многие компании строят целый
it's in fact, the history of previous incidents. Lots of companies have built a whole business out of aggregating information on major incidents.
Среди их клиентов, и у них получается большая база знаний, и они могут
So they end up having a large database, particularly if they've been serving many clients, and they can therefore come up with quite competent
к сожалению, это не всегда
statistical observations.
по большей части это работает для
Unfortunately, it has its own, applicability constraints.
таргетированных атак. Это
It will work for typical incidents. Probably it won't really
если мы подумаем с точки зрения МИД,
hold true for some targeted attacks. However, I think that for specific stages or specific
в рамках
TTPs,
понятно, что их длительность она может быть определена с достаточной точностью.
even if you consult your MITRE, you should be able to
Второй
kind of predict their length with a certain degree of probability or
Я
certainty.
сделаю оговорку здесь, потому что моделирование
Secondly, you can do modeling.
атаки это довольно глубокий,
Modeling
очень
time
масштабная,
to attack
масштабная вещь, которую мы, конечно, вряд ли здесь сможем
is actually a pretty profound thing, and I don't think that we can go into sufficient detail in this discussion. But on the basis of numerous incidents, you can make an assumption about the kind of tactics being used.
Мы понимаем, какие меры
Moreover,
применяются к различным узлам сети, и мы понимаем, какая
we
топология.
can see which measures are being applied, and we can see the topology of this network, and we can also do some pretty detailed
С точки
modeling
зрения времени прохождения этого маршрута может
of the routes, the time it will take the attacker to go through a given route, and so on. Now, if we imagine that, there is a particular network here, and we want to go from A to B, following, say, one of 10 trajectories. This way, we can have a set of these routes, which is a kind of a list, and for every item on the list, you'll have the length and the time it will take to traverse. Next one is assessing response parameters. It's great if you have a large system which has tickets, you log them, you can see how you reacted to such and such incident previously, compare this year to last year. Like what was the queue waiting time, how it got handled, how the playbook was implemented, so on. Like, if you can do that, that's great. That's the best. In all other cases, you will either need to analyze event chains manually, or you will need to do your interview, because, in many cases, this data is only in the minds of the people. Like, you can ask them how they're going to respond to this or that.
Это просто спрашивать у людей, потому что люди часто и охотно об этом говорят.
So asking people is always a good idea. People will often be happy to tell you about it. So how can we use these metrics?
В частности, у нас с вами здесь есть как минимум две интересных вещи, про которые можно с вами
Now, there are two interesting metrics we would like to discuss here. One is TTA to TTC ratio.
Наверное, многие из вас, наверное, учили в институте теорию вероятности.
I guess most of you have studied theory of probability. So, I guess distribution is something you remember very well from your second year. So imagine that we have the population of attacks for the same incident type. They can go through different routes or paths, and that will give us, say, 5 30-minute paths and 2 20-minute paths, and so on. So this is what we show here horizontally. We can create a histogram like this, which can be approximated with this Gaussian-like curve. The same is true for response. You can either use historical data here, or you can you can leverage some assumptions, but in any case, you can put in a diagram like this. I've been fortunate enough to analyze the response strategy of a relatively large customer. And, I was looking at a database of dozens of thousands of responses. So if you remove the outliers related to automated responses, well, they are the whole distribution is pretty comparable to the log normal one. To the normal distribution. The shape of the curve, though, is not that important. What's important is that if we superimpose one curve on the other, the overlapping area will show when we were successful, when the time to contain was significantly shorter than the time to attack, which is like a graphic visualization of the Uruk-hai running to the wall. Another important metric is the so-called mass servicing theory. This is the part of mathematics which is often used to calculate the right number of cashiers at a supermarket, POS operators. What's important for us, though, is that it enables us to calculate how many people we shall need for proper response. Check out Erlang theorem and its consequences if you're interested. So, what do we do? The paradigmally Russian question. So, we can assess the sufficiency of our response capabilities, either based on our inadmissible events or by, say, running interviews. Also, we need to assess I'm sorry. The first item here, know thy fears, is about assessing the inadmissible events, and knowing thyself is about assessing your response capabilities and compare one to the other.
Хотя бы даже на самом начальном простом уровне в виде экспертной оценки. Вот.
For starters, you can use just, an expert assessment of that.
Вы как раз получите ответ, вы получите какое-то
So
расхождение.
as you compare the two, you should be able to see some discrepancy, which should tell you if the attack is going to be successful or not. If you're interested in details, please ask your questions. I will be happy to answer. Yes, thank you very much, Konstantin.
Вопросов много, но я выберу один.
There are lots of questions, but I have time for one only. Hopefully, it's the most interesting one. It's a shame we're strapped for time. How do we calculate the handle time if host containment is done by the IT people?
Если у вас есть
Now, my
в вашей тикетинг-системе, нужно делать
recommendation is like this. If this is your case, you need to integrate your ticketing system with the ticketing system of the IT people. So once their ticket is closed, you should see like an automatic flag going up in your ticketing system. Well, you can do it manually by calling them, but that sucks.
Это всегда будет выгодно. А второе про SLA.
Automated integration will always be useful.
Какой LA должен быть?
What should be the right
IT-услугам обязательно должен включаться LA.
Ну, я думаю, что всегда по...
What kind of IT services really require LA? I think that, whenever you're dealing with emergencies,
наверное, патчинг, я бы сказал, я не
maybe patching, that's off the bat, so to speak. I do not claim that's the most important thing, but I think that patching vulnerabilities, maybe updating antivirus bases,
связанные с экстренной локализацией угрозы.
and other activities related to containing the threat as fast as possible. Thank you so much.